Bring her to me.
The most dangerous men aren't the ones who chase every woman. They're the ones who stop chasing until fate chooses for them. I used to think stories like that belonged in old romance novels, not real life. Then I met Damien Moretti. The rain painted silver lines across the glass walls of the Grand Lexington Hotel, turning Manhattan into a city of blurred lights and restless shadows. Inside, crystal chandeliers scattered warm gold across polished marble, while a string quartet floated softly above conversations worth millions of dollars. I didn't belong there. My black catering uniform had been steamed twice, but it still felt too plain among designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. At 26, I spent my weekdays helping children recover after serious injuries, and my weekends picking up banquet shifts to keep my tiny apartment in Queens and my student loans under control. Rich people celebrated. I carried their champagne. That was the arrangement. I adjusted the silver tray on my shoulder and reminded myself that 5 more hours meant another payment toward my debt. Nothing more. Nothing less. The ballroom buzzed with politicians, CEOs, athletes, and philanthropists pretending money had no weight. Somewhere near the center of the room, a little girl in a pale blue dress wandered away from her parents, her wide eyes filling with panic as the crowd swallowed her whole. I lowered my tray without thinking. "Hey," I said softly, kneeling to her level. "You look like you're searching for somebody." She nodded, gripping the sleeve of my uniform with tiny fingers. "My mommy. We'll find her." I smiled. "Stay with me." She took my hand without hesitation. Children always knew who felt safe. We had barely taken 3 steps when the room changed. It wasn't louder. It became quieter. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. Even the musicians seemed to lose a note. I looked up instinctively. A man had entered through the grand doors wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He wasn't surrounded by chaos. He carried silence with him. Tall, calm, impossibly composed. Dark hair brushed neatly back. Steel gray eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing absolutely nothing. No dramatic entrance. No raised voice. Yet everyone shifted aside before he reached them. Nobody had to explain who he was. Power introduced itself long before names ever did. Damien Moretti accepted polite greetings with little more than a nod, but his attention never lingered on the investors extending their hands or the officials eager to impress him. Instead, his gaze drifted across the ballroom with unsettling patience until it stopped on me. On us. On one exhausted therapist holding the hand of a frightened little girl. For one suspended heartbeat, the entire room disappeared. I couldn't explain it. His expression didn't soften. It didn't harden either. It simply changed in the smallest way, as though some invisible lock inside him had quietly broken after years of refusing to move. A man beside him leaned closer, waiting for instructions. Damien never looked away from me. His voice remained low, almost calm. "Bring her to me." The little girl squeezed my hand as though I were the only familiar thing left in the room, and somehow that simple gesture kept my legs from trembling. 2 men in dark suits approached without rushing, their expressions calm enough that nobody else seemed alarmed. One of them stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Bennett," he said politely, somehow already knowing my name from the badge pinned to my uniform. "Mr. Moretti would appreciate a few minutes of your time." Every instinct told me to refuse. I had another tray waiting in the service hallway, a supervisor who disliked delays, and absolutely no reason to speak with the most intimidating man I had ever seen. "I am working," I answered, forcing a small smile. "Then we will not keep you long." Before I could think of another excuse, the little girl's mother hurried through the crowd, tears filling her eyes as she wrapped her daughter in a grateful embrace. She thanked me over and over before disappearing into the sea of elegant guests. I watched them leave, hoping the moment had quietly ended whatever strange attention had fallen on me. It had not. The 2 men simply waited. Not demanding, not threatening, just patient. Curiosity finally defeated caution. I followed them through a hallway lined with framed black and white photographs of old Manhattan, my footsteps muted by thick carpet that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They opened a pair of walnut doors leading into a private lounge overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. Damien Moretti stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand resting lightly in his pocket, the city lights reflecting across the glass behind him. Up close, he looked even younger than I expected, perhaps 34, with the composed confidence of someone who never needed to prove he belonged anywhere. He turned as I entered, studying me with the same unreadable expression that had unsettled me across the ballroom. "You helped that child without looking around to see who was watching," he said. His voice was calm, measured, almost quiet. "Most people in this room only move when someone important is looking." I folded my hands to hide my nerves. She was scared. That seemed more important. For the first time, something almost resembling amusement touched the corner of his mouth. It vanished so quickly I wondered whether I had imagined it. "Do you always answer questions that honestly?" he asked. "Usually." I met his eyes despite every warning inside my head. "It saves time." Silence settled between us, but it did not feel empty. It felt like he was measuring something invisible, something even he could not explain. Finally he nodded once. "You may return to work, Miss Bennett." I blinked in surprise. That was all. No impossible request. No mysterious offer. No explanation for why I had been brought there in the first place. As I reached the door, his voice stopped me one last time. "Claire." I looked back. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Those words should have ended the night. Instead, they became the beginning of everything. The ballroom looked exactly the same when I returned, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. Crystal glasses still shimmered beneath golden light. The orchestra continued its gentle melody. Waiters floated between tables carrying silver trays filled with tiny works of culinary art. But every few seconds I caught myself searching the room without meaning to. It annoyed me. I had met plenty of wealthy men before. They tipped well, thanked the staff, and disappeared from my life before sunrise. Damien Moretti should have been no different. Instead, his quiet voice lingered in my thoughts far longer than it should have. My supervisor intercepted me near the dessert station with an impatient sigh. "Claire, where have you been? Table 14 is asking for coffee." "Sorry. A guest wanted directions." It was close enough to the truth. I picked up a polished silver coffee pot and headed toward the corner of the ballroom where several executives had gathered. As I poured fresh coffee into delicate porcelain cups, snippets of conversation drifted past me. Stock prices, luxury developments, political campaigns. Everyone sounded certain they controlled the future. It almost made me smile because only minutes earlier I had stood in front of a man who never needed to convince anyone of his influence. He simply existed and everyone else adjusted around him. "Excuse me." A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to find one of Damien's associates standing politely beside me. "Mr. Moretti wishes to offer you a ride home after your shift." I blinked. "That is thoughtful, but I already take the subway." He anticipated that answer. The man handed me a simple white business card with nothing except a phone number embossed in black lettering. No title. No company logo. Nothing. "If you ever need assistance, call." I looked at the card before placing it back into his hand. "Please thank him for the offer, but I do not accept favors from strangers." The associate studied me for a second, almost surprised, before giving a respectful nod. "I will let him know." He disappeared into the crowd as quietly as he had arrived. My heartbeat slowed only after he was gone. Most people would have kept the card. Some might even have considered it a golden opportunity. I thought it felt like accepting a debt I had never agreed to owe. Nearly an hour later, my shift finally ended. I changed into my faded blue jacket, stepped outside the hotel, and inhaled the cool Manhattan air. Rain still covered the streets, reflecting thousands of tiny lights across the pavement like broken stars. I had barely reached the subway entrance when I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It did not move. It did not honk. It simply remained there with its headlights glowing softly through the mist. I told myself it was coincidence. New York was full of expensive black cars. Yet as I descended the station stairs, I could not shake the strange feeling that somewhere above me, unseen eyes were making certain I arrived home safely, and somehow that realization unsettled me far more than if I had been completely alone. The next morning I convinced myself I had imagined most of the previous night. Manhattan had a way of making extraordinary moments feel ordinary, Once the sun climbed above the skyline. My apartment was barely 600 square feet. The radiator clicked every few minutes, and the coffee tasted stronger than it should have because I had forgotten to measure the grounds. Real life returned quickly. By 8 o'clock I was back at the Pediatric Rehabilitation Center, surrounded by finger paintings taped to bright yellow walls and children determined to celebrate every tiny victory. One little boy managed to take 5 unassisted steps across the therapy room, and his mother cried before he even reached the finish line. Moments like that reminded me why I had chosen this career instead of chasing a bigger paycheck. Around lunchtime, my coworker Emily dropped into the chair beside me with an amused smile. "You look distracted." "Long night," I admitted. "The charity event was exhausting." "Did you at least meet someone famous?" I laughed softly. "Not in the way you mean." Before she could ask another question, the receptionist appeared at the therapy room door holding an enormous arrangement of fresh white lilies. Every therapist turned to look. "Delivery for Claire Bennett." I frowned. There must be a mistake. The card attached to the bouquet contained only one sentence. "Thank you for showing kindness when nobody expected it." There was no signature. None was necessary. My stomach tightened. Emily leaned closer. "Secret." "Admirer." I gently closed the card. "Definitely not." I asked the receptionist whether she could return the flowers, but the delivery company had already left. The lilies remained at the front desk all afternoon, filling the clinic with a delicate fragrance that somehow made me feel even more uncomfortable. When my shift finally ended, I carried the unopened arrangement outside, intending to donate it to the nursing home across the street. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, an elderly volunteer struggled with 2 heavy boxes of canned food that slipped from her arms onto the concrete. Without thinking, I set the flowers aside and hurried over to help gather everything before the traffic light changed. We laughed together as rolling soup cans scattered in every direction. Neither of us noticed the black sedan parked half a block away. Inside, Damien watched through the rain-speckled window without saying a word. One of his trusted associates glanced up from a folder resting on his lap. "Everything we found confirms the same picture. No criminal record. No hidden debts beyond student loans. She volunteers twice a month, donates blood regularly, and spends nearly every extra dollar on her patients." Damien kept his eyes on the woman kneeling on the sidewalk, smiling as she handed the last can back to the grateful volunteer. After a long silence, he spoke so quietly it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the rain. "For the first time in 3 years," he said, "I cannot predict my own heart." 3 days passed without another glimpse of Damien Moretti, and I began to believe the strange chapter had quietly closed itself. Life settled back into familiar rhythms. Mornings filled with therapy sessions. Afternoons writing progress reports. Evenings riding the subway home with tired nurses, construction workers, and students balancing backpacks on their knees. The city moved too quickly to leave room for impossible encounters. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Thursday afternoon brought one of the strongest rainstorms of the season. The clinic windows blurred beneath sheets of water while parents hurried inside carrying dripping umbrellas and sleepy children, wrapped in colorful raincoats. Just before closing, our receptionist frowned at the computer screen. "Claire, the elevator is out again. Mrs. Henderson canceled because she cannot carry Ethan up 4 flights of stairs." Ethan was one of my youngest patients, a 6-year-old recovering from spinal surgery. Missing another appointment would slow his progress. I checked the clock, grabbed my bag, and smiled. Then I will go to him. 40 minutes later, I climbed the narrow stairs of an aging apartment building in Brooklyn, arriving completely soaked despite my umbrella. Ethan greeted me with the biggest grin imaginable. "Miss Claire, you came anyway." "Of course I did." I laughed, wiping rain from my jacket. "Heroes do not cancel because of weather." We spent an hour practicing balance exercises using pillows, stuffed animals, and imaginary pirate ships. By the time I left, Ethan had managed 3 careful steps without holding his mother's hand. His celebration echoed all the way down the hallway. Outside, the rain had eased into a gentle drizzle. Across the street, a sleek black sedan rested beneath a maple tree. I recognized it immediately. My pulse skipped before I could stop it. The rear passenger window lowered only a few inches. Damien remained inside, dressed in a dark overcoat instead of the expensive suits I remembered. "How did you know I was here?" I asked, keeping several yards between us. "I did not." His answer came without hesitation. "I knew where you worked. The storm made me wonder whether you would still keep your promise to your patients." I folded my arms. "So you followed me?" "No." He held my gaze with frustrating calm. "I waited outside your clinic. You chose the destination." I should have been angry. Part of me was. Another part noticed something unexpected. His driver had remained inside the car. None of his associates had stepped onto the sidewalk. No one approached me. No one pressured me to come closer. Damien simply sat there while rain tapped softly against the roof of the sedan. "You should go home, Claire," he said quietly. "You have taken care of everyone else today. Allow yourself to rest." Before I could answer, the window rose again, and the car disappeared into the evening traffic, leaving me standing beneath the fading rain with one impossible question circling endlessly through my mind. Why did the most powerful man I had ever met seem determined to protect every boundary I expected him to cross? The following week should have erased him from my thoughts, but instead it quietly wove him into the ordinary moments of my life. I never received another bouquet. There were no expensive gifts waiting outside my apartment, no surprise invitations, no persistent phone calls. If Damien Moretti wanted my attention, he seemed determined to earn it without asking for it. That alone confused me more than anything else. One Friday afternoon, our clinic director called an emergency staff meeting. We gathered in the break room expecting another round of budget cuts, but instead she smiled with tears shining in her eyes. "Someone has anonymously funded our pediatric therapy program for the next 2 years. The room erupted with applause. Several therapists hugged each other while parents waiting in the hallway began crying with relief after hearing the news. "Do we know who donated?" someone asked. The director shook her head. "The donor requested complete privacy." My stomach tightened before my mind could catch up. It could have been anyone. New York was filled with generous people. Yet a quiet voice inside me already suspected the answer. Later that evening, I stopped at a neighborhood grocery store, buying fresh vegetables and a loaf of bread before walking the final few blocks home. The cashier smiled apologetically as she handed me my receipt. "You just missed the gentleman who paid for the groceries of everyone in line before you." I looked toward the rain-speckled windows. A familiar black sedan disappeared around the corner. I hurried outside without thinking. "Mr. Moretti." The car stopped. Damien stepped onto the sidewalk alone, buttoning his charcoal coat against the cool evening breeze. His expression remained calm, although something softer lived behind his eyes now. "Was that you?" I asked, lifting the grocery bag slightly. "Did you donate to my clinic?" He held my gaze for several long seconds before answering. "Would knowing the name matter more than knowing the children will receive treatment?" I opened my mouth then closed it again. He had answered my question without truly answering it. "You cannot keep solving problems for people who never asked you to," I said quietly. "Perhaps not." A faint smile appeared, genuine this time. "But I have spent years solving problems that only created new ones. This feels different." The evening breeze carried the scent of rain between us. For the first time, I noticed the tiredness behind his composed face. Not physical exhaustion. Something much older. Something heavier. 3 years ago," he said almost to himself, "I believed that caring about someone only gave the world another way to hurt you. I convinced myself I was finished with hope." His eyes met mine again, steady and honest. "Then I watched you help strangers when nobody was watching." Before I could find the right words, he stepped back toward the waiting sedan. "Good night, Claire." As the car disappeared into the glowing Manhattan traffic, I realized something that unsettled me far more than our first meeting. I was no longer trying to understand who Damien Moretti was. I was beginning to wonder who he had been before the world convinced him to stop believing in kindness. The city looked peaceful from the outside, but I was beginning to understand that appearances could be carefully designed. 2 weeks passed, and Damien remained a distant presence that somehow never truly disappeared. Sometimes I noticed the same black sedan parked half a block from the clinic. Sometimes I did not. Sometimes I caught myself looking for it without realizing I had started expecting it. That thought alone made me laugh at myself. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, I finished my last appointment early and decided to walk through Riverside Park before heading home. Autumn had finally settled over Manhattan, painting the trees in deep shades of amber and crimson. Children chased pigeons across the pathways while elderly couples shared benches overlooking the Hudson River. It felt wonderfully ordinary. I bought a cup of hot coffee from a small cart and sat beneath a maple tree, enjoying something I rarely allowed myself anymore. Silence. My phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Claire, are you still at the park?" "Yes." "Why?" Her voice sounded unusually tense. "Someone came by the clinic asking strange questions about you after you left. They said they were organizing a charity event, but something felt off. They knew your schedule." A cold feeling settled quietly in my chest. "Did they leave a name?" "No. They left almost as soon as they realized you were gone." We ended the call, but the peaceful afternoon suddenly felt different. The laughter of children continued. The river still shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Yet I could not shake the feeling that someone was watching. I stood, deciding it was probably best to head toward the subway. As I reached the park entrance, the familiar black sedan rolled silently to the curb beside me. Damien stepped out before the driver could open the door. His expression remained composed, but his eyes searched my face with unusual intensity. "Claire," he said quietly, "please get in." I folded my arms. "You are going to have to give me a better reason than that." He respected the distance between us, stopping several feet away. "Someone has taken an unhealthy interest in you." "Because of you?" I asked. For the first time since we had met, he did not answer immediately. The silence told me everything. He lowered his eyes briefly before meeting mine again. "Perhaps." The honesty caught me completely off guard. He could have denied it. He could have hidden behind excuses. Instead, he accepted the weight of the truth. "I never wanted my world to touch yours," he said softly. "But I am beginning to fear that it already has." Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the quiet confidence that always surrounded him disappeared for the briefest moment. He looked back at me, his voice lower than I had ever heard it. "Claire, I need you to trust me. Just this once." For several seconds I simply looked at him while the wind carried crimson leaves across the sidewalk between us. Every sensible part of me said to walk away. I barely knew this man. His name carried enough influence to make entire rooms fall silent, yet he was asking for something no stranger had the right to ask for. Trust. It should have been impossible. And yet his eyes held something I had never expected to see there. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear that he had failed to keep a promise he had never spoken aloud. Without another word, I opened the rear passenger door and climbed into the sedan. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar, warm against the cool autumn air outside. Damien waited until the doors closed before speaking. "Thank you." I folded my hands in my lap. "You still owe me an explanation." He nodded once. "You deserve one." The car moved quietly through Manhattan traffic, while the city glowed beyond rain-speckled windows. Damien stared outside for several moments before finally breaking the silence. 3 years ago, someone I cared about became a target simply because she was close to me. She did nothing wrong. She was kind, generous, and completely innocent. My world reached hers and everything changed. His voice remained steady, but every word carried the weight of years he had never escaped. After that day, I made one promise to myself. I would never allow another woman to stand close enough for my life to become her burden. I listened without interrupting. For the first time, the distance surrounding him made sense. It was not arrogance. It was grief disguised as discipline. "Then why me?" I asked quietly. He turned toward me with complete honesty. "At first I believed I was simply curious. Then I thought perhaps you reminded me of someone I had lost." He shook his head almost immediately. I was wrong. Confusion crossed my face. "You are nothing like her." The answer surprised me more than anything else he had said. "She was cautious where you are fearless. She avoided strangers. You kneel beside frightened children without asking who is watching. She saw the world as dangerous. You insist on seeing the good that still exists inside it." A faint smile touched his face. "You did not awaken an old memory, Claire. You challenged the life I built around that memory." The sedan slowed beside the entrance to my apartment building. Neither of us reached for the door. Neither of us hurried the moment. "You could walk away now," Damien said softly. "In fact, I hope you do. My world is complicated enough without asking someone like you to carry any part of it." I studied him for a long moment before answering. "You keep telling me to leave, yet every decision you make pushes me closer to understanding you." He looked down briefly, almost defeated by the truth in those words. Just then his driver's phone rang through the front speaker. The man's expression changed as he listened. He turned toward Damien with unusual urgency. "Sir, they know where Miss Bennett lives." The words settled over the car like winter itself. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. I looked from the driver to Damien expecting panic, but what I saw instead was resolve. He closed his eyes briefly before giving a quiet instruction. "Make certain Miss Bennett's neighbors remain unaware of anything unusual. No disruption. No fear. I want everyone safe." The driver nodded immediately and stepped outside to make several phone calls, leaving the two of us alone beneath the soft glow of the streetlights. I turned toward Damien. "This is exactly why I should walk away." He lowered his head. "I know." There was no argument. No attempt to persuade me otherwise. "You were right from the beginning," he continued. "My world should never have reached yours. I thought I could stand far enough away to protect you, but even my distance was not enough." His honesty left no room for anger, only silence. I looked through the windshield toward my apartment building where warm lights glowed behind familiar windows. Families were eating dinner. Someone laughed from an upstairs balcony. Life continued beautifully ordinary. "What happens now?" I asked. Damien took a slow breath before answering. "Now I finally do the one thing I should have done the night we met." He opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. Rain had begun again, soft enough to shimmer beneath the streetlights. I followed him outside. For a moment we simply stood facing one another, while the city hurried around us without noticing. "Claire," he said, quietly, "I spent 3 years believing that closing my heart was strength. Then you reminded me that kindness requires far greater courage. I cannot ask you to carry the consequences of my life, so I will not ask you to stay." He reached into his coat pocket and removed the simple white business card I had refused weeks earlier. Looking at it for one brief second, he tore it gently in half before letting the pieces fall into the rain. "You will never hear from me again unless you choose otherwise." Then he stepped back. Not because someone forced him to, because he respected my freedom more than his own wishes. I watched him turn toward the waiting sedan, and suddenly I understood what had changed. The powerful man everyone feared was no longer trying to bring me into his world. He was willing to lose me to protect the life I loved. "Damien." He stopped but did not turn around. I walked across the rain-soaked sidewalk until I stood beside him. Then, without hesitation, I reached for his hand. "You finally gave me a choice," I whispered. "So let this one be mine." He looked at our hands for a long moment, almost unable to believe they were touching. The guarded sadness in his eyes slowly gave way to something brighter than relief. Hope. As the rain continued falling over Manhattan, I realized the city still belonged to Damien Moretti, but the silence inside his heart no longer did. And for the first time in 3 years, neither of us walked away.